Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to talk about a talk on uncovering the language goal in EMI assessment, what students need to learn. So this is the outline for today. I will be giving a brief introduction of EMI first, and then I will talk about EMI assessment, and then I will briefly introduce two studies on the language goal in EMI, and finally, what implications we can see from the two studies. So first of all, just a very brief introduction of EMI. So first of all, what is it? Okay, so EMI is the use of English language to teach academic subjects in contexts where English for the majority of the population is an L2. So in other words, when we use the term EMI, we are assuming that the students will be using English as an L2. That is not their first language. That is also their less familiar language. So in other words, when we try to promote EMI, then the idea is that we are trying to learn the content subjects through the L2 English as the medium of instruction. And in so doing, there will be a dual goal. And Kurt Christensen et al. Also mentioned that this is basically meaning that we are killing two birds with one stone. Okay, so we are trying to learn content subjects and at the same time try to learn L2 English. Although there are, of course, like debates as to whether the English is necessarily the focus in the lesson, because there exists different continuum, whether the focus is more on the content or more on the second language. Nevertheless, if we try to understand the situation, for example, in the context of Hong Kong, then the reason for many parents and students trying to get into EMI secondary schools is to try to learn content subjects through L2 English and at the same time try to brush up their English. So that's why we can still conceptualize that EMI has this dual goal, meaning that students are trying to learn content subjects and at the same time develop their L2 language proficiency. So these claimed benefits of content knowledge, content subject knowledge, as in, for example, biology, geography, history, etc. And the benefit in L2 development, this dual goal seems to be quite attractive because again, you are almost using the same time trying to achieve two goals. Okay, so you have developments in content subject knowledge and also second language. And this is also attractive, especially when EFL alone is not sufficient. Okay, so in other words, if students only receive English input in English lessons, then some students may find that insufficient because they are not making use of their time to get more English input. Okay, so if EMI works, then it is actually a very attractive agenda because it helps students develop not only content subject knowledge, but also the second language English proficiency. But is this dual goal necessarily achieved? Okay, so that is a very important question. So there is the goal, but whether it is necessarily achieved is a question that we need to deal with. So previous research can be categorized broadly into two dimensions. So one would be the product-oriented research, meaning that we are looking into the product. Okay, in other words, we are trying to see what students can achieve at the end of receiving EMI. Okay, so and we do see that from a meta-analysis by Low and Low 2014, it has been found that EMI students enjoyed some advantages in L2 English learning, but this is achieved at the expense of their achievement in content subjects. For example, they may not have they may not become as proficient in science and history knowledge when compared to students who studied in CMI in Hong Kong, for example. Okay, so Chinese medium instruction. And if you look at the advantage in L2, we also need to go more in depth into thinking about whether the gains in L2 is really very surprising. Because if you think about the provision of EMI, meaning that students receive more inputs in L2 English, then it is not very surprising because of the time on task argument. In other words, they spend more time receiving input in English, okay? And of course, we also have what we call the language bath metaphor. It is like immersion, right? So you are getting immersed in English input in content subjects. Yes, okay, there is more gains in L2 English. And of course, when it comes to language proficiency, then we can say that the merrier is one possible goal, okay? Meaning that if students get enrolled in EMI, they develop their L2 English, the more the better, okay? However, what I would question further is whether this enhanced L2 proficiency is sufficient in meeting the target language goal in EMI. So in other words, is the language learning goal of EMI too challenging for some students? Okay, I repeat. So there is gains. There are gains in L2 English, but is this sufficient? Okay, to meet what we call the target language goal in EMI. Okay, in other words, are there some students who may not have developed a sufficient level of L2 proficiency? Yes, they gained something, but not to a sufficient extent, which has rendered them disadvantaged when they are doing EMI. So in other words, we are also questioning whether EMI provide sufficient language learning opportunities in the classroom. So that goes to the second category of research, which is process-oriented research. Okay, so in other words, looking into the process of EMI provision. And if we review the different studies which are process-oriented, then we see that there has been limited interaction in EMI classroom. In other words, teacher talk dominates. Okay, in many studies, Anne et al., Low and Macaro, and there are also some earlier studies have consistently documented that in an EMI classroom, around 90% of the lesson time is teacher talk. Okay. So in other words, there has been very limited interaction and very limited student output in the EMI classroom. And we know that in language learning, in second language acquisition theories and hypothesis, we know that interaction and output is very important to develop language proficiency. So that's why we need to really think about this, okay? Is EMI providing good language learning atmosphere and environment for students? Research has told us that it may not be the case. Furthermore, EMI teachers are also doubtful of their L2 proficiency. So for some EMI teachers, they may not feel that they are very good at L2. And so if they are required to provide input and instruction and interaction in L2 English, they may feel doubtful whether they have this ability. And apart from teachers, we of course also need to think about the students. EMI students also may not have mastered the vocabulary used by the teachers. So in other words, in the classroom, when the teacher is giving instruction, then it has been found that EMI students may not understand all the vocabulary, okay, or a sufficient amount of vocabulary used by the teacher. And furthermore, 84% of the students value content development more than language development. In other words, students are placing a heavier emphasis on content development. For example, learning mathematics, learning biology, learning geography, learning science in general, more than learning language, okay? So their goal is really more targeted to the content, and they feel that they may not have sufficient language to comprehend the teacher input and instruction in the EMI classroom. Furthermore, EMI teachers may not be fully aware of the need to teach L2 or consider themselves responsible to do so. So in other words, if you think about our earlier conceptualization that EMI necessarily has this dual goal, meaning that students are expected to develop both content subject knowledge and L2 English proficiency, it seems that teachers and students may not see it that way, okay? And they may not provide sufficient opportunities for the teaching and learning environments to be filled with interaction and output from students. So this begs the question, is there sufficient language learning opportunity provided? And if we really want to understand if students achieve an adequate level in L2 English, we need to go further to examine another type of research, which is research on EMI assessment. The idea of looking into AMI assessment is to really think about what students are assessed of, okay? Because if you think about assessment, any content subject assessment in EMI necessarily test both content and L2 because students have to read and write in L2 English, which is often, again, their less proficient language. There are some earlier studies, for example, Shaw and Imam have found that candidates with insufficient linguistic resources may not achieve the maximum marks on questions requiring more developed answers in IGCSE. So in other words, linguistic resources or the language proficiency of students could be a barrier for students to attempt assessment in EMI. Similarly, in a research, I collaborated with Dr. Yunyi Lo and Dr. Christy Chiu, also showed that the linguistic demand of assessment questions is a significant predictor on EMI students' performance. So in other words, we try to compare students' performance, EMI and ECMI students' performance, and we found that language, okay, or the linguistic demand of the questions predicts EMI students' performance more than the CMI students, okay? Well, and this is understood in the lens of English being their less proficient language. So in other words, for students who are attempting content subject assessment in Chinese as their first language, for example, then they may not have as many problems when understanding or writing their answers of the assessment in using their language, okay? But for EMI students, because English is most students are less proficient language when compared to Chinese, then they may have more difficulties in reading and writing these questions. So we do need to consider assessment in EMI because it may not accurately reflect students' actual knowledge in content subjects. So in other words, if language is a barrier to some students in expressing their understanding in EMI assessment, then we would question the validity of EMI assessment. Is it really measuring what it intends to measure? And is it accurately reflecting students' learning in the content subjects? Bearing in mind that L2 English is an important goal of EMI, and it is also a requirement in EMI assessment, then it could also, again, be a barrier to some students. If they don't have sufficient English language proficiency or knowledge, then they may not be able to express themselves or express their content subject knowledge well enough, okay? Then in that case, then it could be a barrier to some students. So that's why we really need to delve into EMI assessment and try to pinpoint what is being assessed. Unfortunately, assessment has been a blind spot in many bilingual education programs. And that's why I tried to go into EMI assessment and try to conduct 2 studies in relation to EMI assessment. So the key question to ask when I investigated the language goal in EMI assessment is basically, what is the language goal? Okay, because without knowing the target language goal in EMI, it is very difficult to understand whether students have successfully achieved this goal in EMI, okay? Or whether we can safely say that EMI is being provided successfully, okay? So that's why we really need to pinpoint what is the language goal in EMI. And I've conducted 2 studies with my collaborators to answer this question through, first of all, examining what vocabulary is present in EMI assessment. In other words, when you read the assessment papers in EMI, what vocabulary is present and what vocabulary students need to at least comprehend, okay? Because if they don't understand the vocabulary, then they don't understand the questions, okay? And the second study targets what students need to do. And I investigated the cognitive and also the productive language demand of EMI assessment. So, so basically the first study is more on the receptive demand, and the second one is more on the productive, but also the cognitive demand of EMI assessment. So let me explain what the first study is about. So I tried to investigate the vocabulary demand, and this is a project in collaboration with Dr. Sola Chung, also here at HKMU. And the research questions that we asked were, first of all, what is the language or vocabulary demand in EMI assessment? And secondly, are there any differences in the demands across different subjects? And we analyze assessment papers of the HKDSE. So many of you would be familiar with the HKDSE, but basically this is the standardized exam and a high stakes exam in Hong Kong. And it is also considered university entrance exam, okay? Because when students need to get admitted to university, one of the pathways is that they will use their HKDSE results, okay, to apply for tertiary education. So we analyzed the question papers in the HKDSE, and we chose biology and geography as the two subjects of focus because they are popular among secondary schools in Hong Kong in the senior secondary level. So according to the Hong Kong Examinations and Assessment Authority, biology is offered in 97.5% schools in Hong Kong and geography 93.6%. So they are among the subjects, content subjects that are offered most frequently by different schools in Hong Kong. We sampled HKDSE papers from 2012 to 2019, sampling 792 questions in biology and 681 questions in geography. So, in these assessment questions, there were 34,000 words in biology and also around 21,000 words in geography papers. Okay, so these words are the unit of analysis, okay, because we are looking into the vocabulary used in these assessment paper in order to understand what students need to understand if they need to tackle these assessment papers. And we analyzed the questions according to their vocabulary profiles using Android Profiler developed by Professor Lawrence Anthony. And we sampled K1 to K, we tried to analyze the K1 to K25 words and also the academic words in the EMI assessment. And the results, okay. So we found that for biology, each year of examination papers contained an average of around 4,250 word tokens and 879 word families. And for geography, there were only around 2,700 tokens and 600 word families, okay? So you can already see that biology is more demanding, so to speak, okay? Students need to understand more vocabulary, more words when they attempt the examination papers in EMI. And we found that the high frequency words, mid-frequency words, and also the supplementary lists. So K1 to K3, meaning that they are the most frequent vocabulary or words in English. Okay, for example, the articles. Okay, for example, the pronouns. Okay, and so on and so forth. So they are very frequent vocabulary items in English. The mid-frequency words, they are less frequent, okay, in English. That may be slightly more challenging for students. And we also investigated supplementary lists, which included the proper nouns, for example, such as in the geography paper, there would be many locations, right? For example, Lantau Island, okay, then that would be a proper noun. So we found that the high frequency words, the mid frequency words, and the supplementary lists together give 95% coverage for biology and 98% for geography. In other words, for biology papers, among the 4,000 something word tokens, okay, 95% would be the high frequency words the mid-frequency words, and the supplementary lists. Okay, and for geography, among the 2,700 words, 98% would be the high frequency, mid frequency, and supplementary words. Okay, so if we why do we look into this coverage? Because we have this magic number, okay, provided in vocabulary research, which suggests that the minimum threshold for unassisted comprehension would be 95% of words appearing in texts. So so we can borrow that percentage and say that in order to comprehend the assessment papers, then students need to at least have the high frequency, mid frequency, and also the supplementary words, okay, for both biology and geography. And this is how we make sense of this. Okay, so to adequately understand the exam papers, students need to master at least the mid-frequency words. And we can also see from these results that biology has a higher demand than geography. And if we take into account all 8 years of exam papers together, then we also want to find out, okay, if this represents what vocabulary students need to master in the 2 subjects, then we found that for biology, including all 8 years of exam papers, there are 2,398 different word families, okay, in biology. And for geography, only 1,600. But more importantly, if you look at what are the vocabulary being shared among the 2 subjects, then you would see that for K1 to K3 words, okay, again, these are the most frequently occurring vocabulary in English. We see that around 43%, okay, appeared in both subjects. But if you look at the mid-frequency and the low-frequency words, can you see that the percentage is very low, okay? Only 9% and 1.75% of mid-frequency and low-frequency words are being shared by the 2 subjects. In other words, for a student, okay, if there is a student, for example, taking both biology and geography, then the number of vocabulary that these students needs to master would be much more, okay, because there are not many vocabulary that is shared between the 2 subjects. And if you calculate the entire vocabulary profiles, then we see that on average, okay, then we have 25% of words shared among the 2 subjects. So in other words, again, for a student taking both biology and geography exam in the HKDSE, then there will be lots of vocabulary that are not shared, and the students need to master many more vocabulary items, okay, in order to attempt both question papers. And we also look into the academic words being used, and we found that the biology papers contained on average around 77%, and geography papers 9%. And so in other words, the academic words are also required if we need to understand the exam papers. And when examining the total number of word families, again spanning across the 8 years of the examination papers, then we again see that around 45% of the academic words were shared by both subjects. But what it means is that more than half of the academic words were not shared by the 2 subjects. And I have given some examples here. For example, for biology, we have some academic words such as deduce, evolve, hypothesis that appear in biology, but not in geography. And geography has other academic words that appear uniquely in the geography papers. For example, constrain, evaluate, and facilitate. And at the same time, there are also some words that appear in both papers, okay? For example, affect, identify, and method. So if we also try to go more in depth into the academic words being used by the 2 subjects, then we can see that there are some academic words that are used with that has high occurrence in one subject. Okay, for example, biology, we have an academic word process, which occurred quite frequently, but not so much in geography. Okay, well, still moderately. Okay. At the same time, we have the academic word impact appearing frequently in geography, but rarely in biology. Okay, so when we try to map these academic words being used in the two subjects, then actually, although 45% of the words were shared by the two subjects, some of them are used more often in one subject and rarely in another subject. So in other words, again, for a student who is taking both subjects, then there will be a lot of vocabulary items, academic vocabulary that the students need to master with varying levels of importance in the two subjects. Okay, so one academic word may be more important. For example, impact may be more important in geography, but it is less important in biology. Okay, in terms of its frequency of occurrence, at least. So that is the first study. Okay, trying to investigate what vocabulary items are present in EMI assessment, and we see some differences. In fact, quite a lot of differences among the two subjects, biology and geography. Now, we move on to the second study, which investigates not only the vocabulary level, but also a more like a comprehensive overview of the cognitive and language demand in EMI assessment. And this is a paper in collaboration with Dr. Yunyi Lo from the University of Hong Kong. And the context of study is grade 7 to 12, EMI science and biology, okay? And we sampled data from a set of junior secondary science textbooks or workbooks with 2,491 questions. We also had a set of senior secondary biology textbooks or workbooks with 1,600 questions. And we also, again, have some HADSE biology papers and the questions. So we try to compare the EMI assessment from junior to senior secondary, okay, as well as the type of assessment from, okay, textbooks would be more formative assessment to more summative assessments in HADSE. Okay, so we try to compare the assessment questions and their demand, okay, on students from junior to senior secondary and from formative to summative assessment. And we analyzed the questions using an analytical framework that we developed. So you can see that, first of all, we can read this. There is the cognitive demand. So there are some questions that only required recall of knowledge. So basically just remembering what they have learned, okay? Or some questions that require the application, and some questions that require analysis of, for example, a new scenario, okay? We also read questions, okay, analyze questions according to the language demand or the linguistic demand. So, for example, whether the questions are presented in a sentence, okay, or students need to read a text, okay, or they just need to understand some vocabulary and they can answer the question, okay? So that is receptive demand. And we also look at the productive language demand. In other words, do students need to write anything, okay? First of all, there are some questions that require no writing. For example, multiple choice questions. Then students only need to write, well, or even just marking ABCDs, okay? Then we call it no productive demand. There is also productive vocabulary, meaning that students need to just write a word, okay? There would be some questions that demanded at the sentence level. So students need to write a sentence in full sentence. And there are also some questions that demanded a text, okay? So a few sentences that together will be a text, okay? For example, an essay type question, okay? Then the students need to produce and write an entire text to answer the EMI assessment. So let me try to demonstrate what this analytical framework is, how this is used. For example, this question is analyzed as a receptive sentence because students are reading sentences, okay? And it is a productive vocabulary question because students only need to produce a vocabulary item, okay? So they don't need to write any sentence. The sentence has been provided to them. They only need to write the vocabulary item in the boxes provided, in the spaces provided. And this is just a cognitively, it is just a recall, because they only remember, okay, what is how food is being digested, okay, and what how so basically they just recall what is the vocabulary item. So that's why it is the productive vocabulary being tested and cognitive recall. The second question, again, this is a receptive sentence because students are reading sentences, okay, and there is no productive demand because they do not need to write anything. They only need to mark the answer. Is it A, B, C, or D? Okay. This is also a cognitive recall because they just try to remember which parts in the alimentary canal and which food substance is being digested. And this is another question that this would be receptive sentence. And students this time, because they are reading sentences, this time they need to produce sentence as well, okay? Because when they are attempting this question, this EMI assessment question, then students need to write maybe 2 sentences, okay, 2 or 3 sentences to try to explain how the structures in A and B assist in the production, absorption of the products of protein digestion. And this is cognitive application because now we have a scenario here. We need to, based on this photo, which shows the structure, and then students need to explain how, okay, digestion goes about. Okay, so this is application question. And finally, one more example. This is again, students are understanding at the sentence level. They are reading some sentences, but they need to produce a text this time. This is because this is an essay question. Students are trying to compare and contrast arteries and veins in blood vessels, okay? And they try to discuss the structural differences and how they maintain blood flow, okay? So this is a very biology question, but you can see that students need to write a text, okay, when they try to explain how the 2 blood vessels differ. And also comparing, contrasting, and that's why they need to move on to the cognitive level of analysis, okay? So not just recalling something, they need to compare and contrast, okay, according to the Bloom's taxonomy. So these are the findings. We found that in junior science textbook, okay, let me explain this diagram. It requires some explanation. First of all, we can look at the coloring, okay? The blue bars, okay, in these bar charts are the recall questions. So they are cognitively, they are not very challenging, okay? We have some green bars, which are application. So cognitively more demanding. And we have also some yellow bars, which are analysis, cognitively very demanding. And you can see that the percentage in junior science textbooks, the bars for analysis are very low. Okay, so in other words, not many questions required analysis of understanding of knowledge. Lots of the questions only recalling. Okay, but more importantly, we are interested in the language demand, right? Because we are thinking about the language goal. So when you look at these numbers, so let's look at the bars with the highest bars. Okay, so we read this. Okay. Which we categorize as 2-0. Okay, what does 2-0 means? It means that students only read sentences and they do not need to produce any language. Okay, because they only, for example, write a letter or they only mark a multiple choice question. So in other words, in junior science textbooks, many questions do not require production of language. Okay, students only need to write, for example, a letter, let's say A, B, C, D, or they need to only mark the answer as in, like, again, a multiple choice question, A, B, C, D. Okay, so this is how we read this diagram. The second diagram, senior biology textbooks. Okay, so again, we can first pay attention to the coloring. Okay, if we look at the colors that has the most representation in this diagram, then it would be the green bars. So it would be the application questions. Okay, you can see the green bars. There are many questions that required application of knowledge cognitively. Again, we are interested in the language goal. So let's look at the bars with the most, again, the highest bars. And this time it would be the 22, okay, the 2-2, okay. So what are the 2-2s? This time it is receptive sentence, so students reading sentences, and they also need to produce sentences. So when you compare junior science and senior biology, you can see that students need to produce more language, okay? This time they need to produce sentences in order to answer the EMI assessment question, okay? In junior secondary, they only need to, they do not need to produce any language. They only need to write ABCDs, okay? The letters or even number. And you can also see that there are some questions, okay, that students need to read a text, okay, and also produce sentences. And if we look at also focus on this one, okay, the 2-3s, okay, then we can see that students also need to start producing texts, okay. So in other words, they need to start writing, for example, essay type questions, okay, in senior biology textbooks, in the senior biology questions. Now, moving on to the HKDSE, we can see that when you compare the two, okay, you can see that this time the analysis questions there are more analysis questions. If you focus on the yellow bars, there are more analysis questions in the HKDSE. And these analysis questions are tested, okay, requiring students to, again, produce some sentences. Again, when you look at the 2-2s, okay, students need to read sentences and also produce sentences when they attempt these questions. You can also see that the 2-3s are catching up, okay? This time, students need to write more in terms of like writing a text, okay? So now in the HKDSE, there are proportionately more text production questions. In other words, students need to sometimes write a short text or a short essay, okay, when they attempt the EMI HKDSE questions. So when you compare and contrast junior secondary science textbooks, senior biology biology textbooks, and senior biology HKDSE, okay, the summative exam, the standardized exam, then you can see that we actually have some significant differences, okay? So for example, S4 to S6, senior biology, we have more application and analysis questions at the sentence and text production level, okay? So meaning that, for example, the 2-2 and 2-3s, we have more, okay? Significantly more sentence and text production questions in senior biology. Also, this is seen in when we compare the junior science textbooks and the HKDSE biology questions. When we compare the formative assessment, okay, in the biology textbooks and the summative assessment of HKDSE biology, then we also see some differences. And this time, there are significantly more questions requiring analysis and text production in HKDSE. So if you try to compare these, then my arguments, okay, is whether we can see a very significant progression, or it is not even a progression, but a big leap that students need to be able to achieve in order to succeed in EMI senior secondary public exam, okay, in the HKDSE. If you think about the preparation given to students for example, in textbook materials, then students actually need more language output, okay? They need to produce more texts, they need to produce more sentences, they need to analyze scenarios, they need to compare and contrast, they need to design an experiment and write it out, they need to try to deduce what happens from an experiment, okay, what are the findings, and so on and so forth. So in other words, I would argue that this is a big leap that students need to be able to achieve in order to succeed in EMI senior secondary standardized high stakes assessment in biology. And my question is, are students prepared cognitively and linguistically when they need to attempt, again, the EMI assessment questions, which require them to produce not only vocabulary, but sentence and texts? So we also have some qualitative findings from Marcus' report from the HADSE, and it has been said by the Marcus that students have weaknesses in giving accurate or clear or complete description and explanation. They have a lack of attention on sentence structures, especially on data analysis and comparison. They have poor organization, cohesion, and structured response. And with the language used in making comparison, deductions, reporting, the majority were incapable of making comparisons and gave two separate descriptions instead. So we see that there are problems. Students need to tackle the linguistic demand, okay? Because this is what is being tested, okay? This is what they are tested when they attempt EMI assessment. So concluding the two studies, then the first studies tells us that EMI assessment is not easy. Students need to master quite a large number of vocabulary items, at least receptively. Okay, they at least need to understand when they read the questions. And the minimum target vocabulary items for biology would be 2,000 something word families, and around 700 of them would be the mid and low frequency words. For geography, the minimum target vocabulary items would be 1,600 word families, and around 400 would be mid and low frequency word. So I call this minimum because we only analyzed 8 sets, or well, together biology and geography, 16 sets of examination papers and the vocabulary being used in the questions. We need to enlarge the data set, okay, but this is at least a preliminary attempt to try to pinpoint what is the target vocabulary language goal in EMI assessments in biology and geography, okay? And we see that, well, at least, okay, 700 mid and low frequency words in biology and at least 400 mid and low frequency words in geography. And if we again repeat the finding that only 9% mid frequency and 1.75% low frequency words were shared among the two subjects, then students really need to, like, if they take 2 subjects, then they need to master more vocabulary. And they also need to master academic vocabulary, and more than half were not shared by the 2 subjects. Again, there are some subject-specific vocabulary that we have found. And from the second study, then we focus on the productive demand and the cognitive demand as well. And we see that the language demand is also quite high, and students need to be able to demonstrate their higher order thinking cognitively. For example, analyzing, creating, deducing, using sentences or texts. So both the cognitive and the productive linguistic demand is quite high for EMI assessment. And we argue that EMI can pose potential linguistic hindrance to some students because, as I have demonstrated, there is a big leap from junior to senior secondary EMI assessment requirements. And this big leap would necessarily present challenges to at least some EMI students. So what are the implications of these 2 studies? So first of all, in terms of research, then we do need more studies to be conducted to specify the language demand, especially because so many vocabulary is not being shared by different subjects. Then we need to specify these subject-specific vocabulary items, which is also considered the interface of language and content in EMI, okay? Because if they are subject-specific, then they relate to the content, okay? And they're also relating to the language because they are vocabulary items that students need to master. And a useful angle to investigate this target goal, I would propose, is through analyzing assessments, because this is what students need to do at the end of their secondary EMI education. And what is, so that's why, what is the language goal in EMI? I would argue that we do need more research, and it is not only the more the merrier, okay? So of course, if you have more language proficiency, if you have more vocabulary, that's good, but is it enough, okay? We really need to specify what is the language goal by a larger scale studies focusing on more subjects. Because when more subjects are analyzed, we can begin to define the language goal in EMI using clearer terms. We can also answer the sufficiency question I posed in the beginning with evidence. In other words, do EMI learners achieve the expected language goal in the curriculum? And in order to answer this question, we need more research, okay? And pedagogically, the learning of vocabulary should not be neglected in EMI. So I made a very bold assumption that students in senior secondary in EMI probably know many high-frequency words, okay? The most frequent 1,000 to 3,000 words in English. We can assume that many students would be able to master them, okay, according to some previous research. However, okay, so even if we assume that, there is still a lot to learn because there are like 700 mid and low frequency words in biology and 400 mid and low frequency words in geography that students need to be able to master. And is it a lot? Yes, because many of these are not shared and students take more than one EMI subject. So in other words, when we think about students taking more than one EMI subjects in the HADSE, for example, at the end of secondary education, or even in the course of taking secondary education, they need to master many different vocabulary items because they take more than one EMI subject. And teachers should also include language objectives in the EMI curriculum and help students develop a range of vocabulary learning strategies to meet linguistic demand. And learners too can place more emphasis on the language required in content subjects, not just receptively, but also productively, okay? As I mentioned earlier in the literature review, EMI students, they usually place a heavier emphasis on content knowledge achievement. But if we consider that they are actually being assessed in their language as well, then they need to also consider language as an important goal in their learning in EMI. And from the second study, the assessment analysis framework that Dr. Low, Uni Low, and I proposed can be used to diagnose and cater for the diversified needs of their students. So, for example, in designing EMI assessment, we can try to examine whether the EMI assessment questions are too heavily focused on certain areas. For example, if an EMI assessment only asks students to produce vocabulary, not up to the sentence or text level, then it may not be sufficient, okay? And finally, more collaboration between EMI and EFL teachers would be beneficial because they are experts in different areas, okay? EMI are experts in content subjects, and EFL teachers, English teachers, they are experts in language, okay? So if we see more collaboration among EMI and EFL teachers, that would be beneficial to the learning and teaching in EMI. So that's all for this seminar, and thank you very much. And if you have any questions and comments, you can send to my email, and I'm very happy to answer them. And of course, if you have any questions now, I would be very happy to answer them as well verbally. Thank you.